Welcome to Medieval Filth. Hello, folks. Tonight, we descend into the grime-caked rabbit hole of hygiene in the 1200s. Not the nice, soft focus version with scented candles and warm towels. No, nothing of the sort. This is medieval hygiene, where clean was a spectrum and bathing was a team activity shared with strangers. Barn animals and whatever diseases happened to be floating by that month, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. It is always fun to see who else is lying in bed, wondering if people really used fermented urine as shampoo. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. When historians talk about medieval Europe, they often focus on kings, battles, and grand architecture. What they mention less often is the constant, unrelenting smell. It drifted through cities and villages alike, a thick blend of human bodies, smoke, stagnant water, and the occasional dead animal tucked behind someone's shed. People did not just smell bad, they smelled creative. It was not because they did not care. Hygiene actually mattered. It just had different rules. Most peasants believed that washing too often could actually make them sick. Bathing opened the pores, they said, and that allowed illness to crawl in and take up residence, like a rude house guest. Cleanliness was not about being sterile. It was about avoiding demons that rode on hot steam. Bathing, when it happened, was an ordeal. In towns, people used public bathhouses. These were large wooden structures where hot water was poured into shared tubs, often reused without a full cleaning between customers. Think of it as medieval group therapy, but with fewer breakthroughs and more floating hair. Some bathhouses were respectable, others were less so. The dividing line between a steamy soak and a side business, involving whispered negotiations, was very, very thin. And yes, historians still argue whether public baths were really for cleanliness or for gossip matchmaking, and possibly a few other extracurriculars for peasants without access to bathhouses. The setup was simpler. A wooden tub, a bucket, and hope water had to be hauled from a well or stream, heated over a fire, and then lugged inside without spilling too much of it. The tub itself was reused over and over, often by multiple family members in a single session. First the father, then the mother, then the children, in descending order of seniority and increasing filth by the time the baby got in the water, resembled thin gravy with a hint of turnip soap was technically available. It was made from animal fat and ash boiled down into a lumpy paste that removed dirt and most of your skin. For those who could not afford soap or feared it might ruin their complexion, alternatives included sand vinegar or the vigorous application of Prayer's hair. Washing presented its own problems. Combs were often made from bone or wood, and lice were considered just part of the deal. Remedies included smearing rosemary soaked in vinegar on the scalp, or sleeping with garlic braided into your hair, like some kind of pungent medieval dream catcher. These methods worked well enough to irritate the lice, but not necessarily to eliminate them. Historians still argue whether these treatments were effective or just made people smell like a salad teeth cleaning or something loosely resembling. It did exist. Chewing sticks made from aromatic wood were used to freshen breath, and some households had tooth powders made from crushed eggshells, charcoal, and salt. The goal was not to prevent cavities. That concept had not arrived yet, but to avoid driving people away with your breath. In extreme cases, people rubbed their gums with mint or onion juice, which might explain why courtship was mostly conducted from a safe distance. Laundry was no less adventurous. Most clothing was made of wool or linen, and peasants often wore the same set for days, if not weeks. Undergarments, when used, helped absorb sweat and grime, but the outer layers took the brunt of it. Washing involved dragging the clothes to the nearest river, scrubbing them with ash or soap on flat stones, and beating them until they either looked clean or simply gave up. This was not a daily routine. Washing clothes was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Most people did it a few times per season, usually when the smell began to develop a personality of its own. After washing, clothes were laid out on bushes or hedges to dry, which also conveniently aired them out for the entire village. And yet, despite the dirt and stink, medieval people did try to smell better. They carried scented herbs in pouches or rubbed lavender on their wrists. Wealthier folk might own perfumed gloves or small balls of ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines that for some reason became highly fashionable. If you could afford it, you masked your natural scent with something equally strange. If you could not, you just hoped everyone else smelled worse. Odors were a part of daily life, so much so that cities began to develop their own reputations. London, for instance, was known not just for its size, but for the unique blend of fish markets, tanning pits, and communal waste ditches that gave it what one monk politely described as a memorable fragrance. Medieval homes contributed to the problem. Most had no chimneys, so smoke from cooking fires clung to walls, skin, and every scrap of fabric in the house. Combine that with poor ventilation, damp straw bedding, and livestock wandering through the front door, and you had yourself a scent profile that could best be described as agricultural, with notes of despair. Still, people found ways to cope. Some lined their homes with dried herbs. Others burned resin or incense when company came over in wealthier households. Servants sprinkled floors with rushes mixed with fragrant petals, which slowly turned brown and crunchy underfoot, absorbing moisture and masking more pungent realities. There were also rituals in monasteries. For example, monks washed their hands before meals and performed symbolic foot washings. Pilgrims were sometimes required to cleanse themselves in rivers before entering sacred sites. But again, this was less about hygiene in the modern sense and more about spiritual purification. Dirt on the body was tolerable. Dirt on the soul was not bathing. Customs varied wildly by region in parts of Italy and the Middle East. Frequent bathing was more common, even encouraged in colder regions. Bathhouses fell out of favor, especially during times of plague when people believed that warm water opened the body to disease better. To stay dry and dusty than risk inviting death in with the steam. By modern standards, medieval hygiene was a disaster. But for its time, it was a complex system of habits, beliefs, and adaptations to the realities of limited water, poor infrastructure, and a very different understanding of disease. And perhaps that is the real takeaway. People did not give up on being clean, they just defined it differently. They improvised, they endured, they found dignity where they could, in a sprig of rosemary behind the ear, in a bucket of barely warm water, in the simple act of trying bathing in the 1200s was not just an act. Bathing rituals of the sort of clean. It was a full performance, equal parts ambition, discomfort, and mild hazard in a world where hot water was a luxury and privacy was optional. The simple act of trying to get clean became something closer to a community event, or depending on the location, a small scandal. Let us begin with the private bath, if such a thing could be called private. Wealthier individuals might own a large wooden tub, often barrel-shaped, sometimes even with handles for easier transport. It sat near the hearth, or if they were feeling especially brave in the garden on a sunny day, servant or two would lug in hot water by the bucket, a process requiring muscle firewood and an alarming number of trips. The water never stayed hot for long. By the time the tub was full, it had usually cooled to lukewarm and had acquired a few floating particles from the bucket or the soot-covered kettle. Some poured the water through a linen cloth to filter out debris, a noble effort that usually failed. Others did not bother, after all. What was a bit of grit compared to the privilege of not smelling like feet and sheep? For a few hours soap, if it was involved, came in the form of homemade lime mixtures or hard cakes made from rendered fat. The smell was somewhere between bacon and burnt wood, and the texture was equally ambiguous. In towns, bathhouses were the norm. These were not luxurious Roman spas. These were wooden buildings that resembled barns or sheds, filled with steam, low benches, and the unmistakable aroma of boiled bodies and herbs. Bathers entered in shifts, soaked in shared tubs or individual barrels, and endured either bliss or mild horror, depending on who had bathed before them. For an extra fee, one could pay for scented herbs to be added to the water, lavender, mint, sage-fragrant attempts to wrestle body odor into submission. There were also attendants who offered scrubbing services. These ranged from gentle massages to something that resembled an attempt to sandblast your sins away. Houses often had multiple rooms with varying temperatures, a hot chamber, a warm soak area, and a cool room for rinsing or, more often, for gasping dramatically after leaving the steam. It was in theory a place for cleansing. In practice, it was also a social center, a gossip mill, and occasionally a venue for activities best left undescribed in polite company. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were true hygiene centers or simply steamy salons for whispers and wages. The church had complicated feelings about all this. On one hand, cleanliness was associated with godliness. On the other, too much nudity and enjoyment in a bathhouse raised the suspicions of sin. Certain regions outlawed mixed bathing. Others ignored it entirely. Some bathhouses posted moral warnings on their doors. Others offered towels and subtle winks. Enforcement depended entirely on which bishop was nearby and how grumpy he was. That morning, bathing customs were also seasonal. In summer, baths were more frequent, if only because heat and sweat made the consequences of skipping obvious. In winter, the number of bathers dropped dramatically. Heating water became even more of a chore, and there was a genuine fear that a warm bath in a cold house would make someone ill. Better to remain coated in protective grime than to catch a fatal chill while attempting self-care. Peasants, of course, bathed differently. Their tubs were smaller, their water colder, and their sense of privacy non-existent. A family might bathe together or in quick succession. Using the same water, the order mattered. Eldest first, youngest last soap was optional. Herbal rinses were more common water, boiled with thyme or rosemary. Sometimes nettles, sometimes beer. The herbs added fragrance, and the beer added bragging rights. Some improvised entirely a quick dunk in a river or stream. was the poor man's bath. Brave souls might break ice to do it winter. Others simply waited for rain and stood under their roof's runoff like damp scarecrows. It was not ideal, but it got the job done, at least until they had to explain to a neighbor why they were naked in the yard. Again, children were bathed the most often, not out of particular concern for their hygiene, but because they were more likely to soil themselves, fall in mud, or develop rashes. Babies were bathed in small wooden basins or buckets. The water was warmed with great care, and herbs were added for both cleanliness and superstition. Some mothers believed in washing their infants in milk, others in ale, and some in mixtures that defy polite explanation. There were also regional quirks in parts of Scandinavia. Steam baths and sauna-like rituals persisted through the Middle Ages, rooted in older traditions. These were often separated by gender and included both cleansing and socializing, with the added bonus of not freezing to death afterward. In contrast, other regions were less enthusiastic. Certain communities believed that frequent washing weakened the body. Dirt, they argued, served as a barrier against disease and malevolent spirits. In a way, they were not entirely wrong. Filth might not repel demons, but it did keep nosy neighbors at a distance. Medieval medical texts offered opinions too. Some physicians recommended warm baths to balance the humors. Others warned that they opened the pores to dangerous vapors. A bath could be prescribed for melancholy or banned outright for hysteria. Pregnant women were told to avoid hot water. The elderly were advised to use only tepid rinses. The general message was clear: bathe if you must, but do not enjoy it too much, and certainly do not get creative. There were exceptions. Of course, nobles sometimes bathed with flair. Perfumed oils, rose petals, music, and poetry readings. It was not so much a bath as a sensory theater. Courtiers might bathe before important events or public appearances. Some chroniclers describe pre-wedding purification baths, complete with scented sponges and attendants standing by with silver bowls. These were as much displays of wealth as they were acts of hygiene. But even among the elite, bathing frequency was modest. Once a week was considered luxurious. Once a month was respectable. Once a season was acceptable, provided you used enough perfume. The truly rich had access to private bathhouses within their estates. But even these were often used more as showpieces than daily fixtures, perhaps. The most telling indicator of medieval bathing habits lies in the language. Phrases like washing the head often referred to partial bathing, not full immersion to wash up, might mean the hands and face. Only full body baths were rare, expensive, and vaguely suspicious if someone emerged too clean. People noticed, and not always kindly. There is a certain logic to it. Heating enough water for a full bath, pouring it, maintaining temperature, drying off, all required time, resources, and help. Then there was the aftermath. Wet floors, dripping clothes, and the problem of drying your body in a drafty house where windows were made of animal hide and the breeze did not care about your modesty. So bathing remained what it was, a gesture, a ritual, a sometimes successful attempt at reclaiming your own body from the grime and smoke of daily life. It was not just about getting clean, it was about trying. And in a world of mud paths, smoky hearths, and shared water, trying counted for something. The business of public bathhouses. Public bathhouses in the 200s were not merely places to scrub away dirt. They were cultural crossroads, halfway between communal cleansing stations and neighborhood. Social clubs. These were spaces where someone could sit naked in a tub with a merchant, a gossiping widow, a tax collector, and possibly a barber, and somehow leave with cleaner skin and dirtier secrets. These bathhouses were often humble structures, wooden, low-ceilinged, and heavy with steam that never quite escaped, no matter how many windows were wedged open with sticks. The walls were damp, the floors creaked ominously, and the air inside was a heady mixture of rosemary, boiled sweat, and civic optimism. Functionally, a bathhouse was divided into different rooms, each with its own purpose. The main soaking room had large communal tubs, or if the town could afford it, a pool carved into the floor and lined with stone. In smaller towns, the tubs were just oversized barrels. There were also steam rooms, known in some areas as sweat chambers, where visitors sat swaddled in towels, inhaling moist herbal vapors and pretending they were not slowly roasting like turnips. Bathhouses had operating hours, posted by the door, usually marked on a plank in rough charcoal. Men and women often bathed separately. Though this was not a universal rule, some towns allowed mixed bathing, especially during festivals. This led to a curious intersection of hygiene courtship and what the clergy called opportunities for unguarded conversation. Others took it further, hosting evening sessions lit by torchlight, attended by those seeking warm water and warmer company upon entry. Visitors paid a small fee, sometimes a coin, sometimes a barter. A few eggs, a bit of cheese, or a scrap of leather could be enough for a basic soak. For this fee, the bather received access to hot water, oil that might be cleanish, and sometimes a brush or strigil for scraping off stubborn grime. Some bathhouses offered robes made of coarse linen. Others encouraged guests to bring their own, though not all complied. Disrobing was done in a shared changing space, which meant accepting the unspoken truth. Everyone was looking and everyone was pretending not to clothes were hung on pegs, sometimes stacked by class. A noble's garments were not stored next to a baker's apron, unless one wanted to start a scandal or a rumor about one. The water was another matter. Freshness was not its defining feature. Bathhouses typically reused the same tub for multiple guests, replenishing it with hot water throughout the day and skimming the top with a bucket or reed strainer. Some patrons believed this gave the bath character. Others believed it gave them rashes. Both were probably correct. Herbs were added not just for scent, but for their supposed medicinal properties. Marjoram for the joints, thyme for circulation, sage for clarity of thought. A good bath keeper knew how to balance the blend depending on the clientele. More lavender when older women visited, more nettle and mustard seed when bachelors arrived claiming to be aching from farming. Bathhouse staff included water carriers, wood stokers, and bath attendants who offered scrubbing services. A few bathhouses employed barbers who shaved heads and faces with a blade so dull it counted as exfoliation. Others hired musicians, lutes, pipes, and drums to distract guests from the dubious hygiene of their surroundings. And in wealthier cities, storytellers sat by the steam rooms recounting tales of love treachery, or the time someone slipped on soap and caused a 3-person pile-up for an additional fee. Guests could request massage treatments, scented oils, or even beauty advice from older attendants who claimed to have once worked for nobility. Advice included such timeless gems as do not squint at the sun, do not eat onions before social events, and never trust a man who bathes too often. Despite all this, bathhouses were not just for indulgence. They were a part of health care. Physicians sometimes prescribed regular bathing for ailments like melancholy, fatigue, or spleen congestion, a condition only the medieval imagination could properly define. A hot bath was said to draw out bad humors and restore balance. Cold baths, on the other hand, were believed to shock the soul back into proper alignment. There were rules, though mostly unwritten. One did not criticize another person's skin lesions. One did not ask why someone was wearing a necklace in the bath. One definitely did not point out when someone snored in the steam room. The community upheld these rules not with punishment, but with passive-aggressive silence and lingering glances. The church remained deeply suspicious of bathhouses. Too much time was spent lounging naked with strangers seemed like a recipe for moral decay. Priests warned that bathhouses blurred the lines between necessity and temptation. Some clergymen went so far as to declare frequent bathing a form of vanity bordering on heresy. Naturally, this only made bathhouses more popular when outbreaks of disease occurred. Bathhouses were often among the first places shut down, blamed for spreading illness. Ironically, some towns tried to fight plague with even more bathing, scrubbing their bodies with vinegar or steeping in wine-laced baths in hopes of avoiding contagion. Whether it worked or not is unclear, but it certainly led to some very expensive laundry bills for many townspeople, especially the poor bathhouses offered a temporary escape from crowded homes and filthy alleys. Inside those foggy rooms, one could forget about fieldwork taxes or the rat currently occupying the family pantry. There was warmth, music, conversation. There was a sense, however fleeting, that the world could be manageable, even soft around the edges. And it was not all politics and propriety. Bathhouses birthed legends. Songs were written about loves ignited in the steam. Poems lamented betrayals revealed during back scrubbings. One apocryphal tale tells of a nobleman who slipped during a particularly enthusiastic massage and accidentally proposed marriage to the wrong person. They were wed 3 days later and reportedly had a decent life. Even the architecture played a role. Floors were sloped toward drains when drains existed, though not all of them LED anywhere helpful. A few simply ended at the wall, which meant the water pooled, until someone noticed or slipped. Walls were built thick to retain heat and prevent peeping. Ropes were low to trap steam, and ceilings often dripped ominously in rhythm with the musicians outside. And then there were the bathhouse nicknames. Patrons bestowed names with affectionate sarcasm. The lukewarm barrel, the mutton broth. St. Steam's the place where I lost my sock and my dignity. These were places that had character. They were part of the town's personality, as vital as any market square or church bell. One could track the shifting seasons through bathhouse chatter. Spring brought complaints about muddy roads. Summer brought sandal blisters and rumors about traveling performers. Autumn arrived with talk of harvest, tax collection, and unsolicited recipes involving cabbage. Winter meant fewer patrons, more firewood, and a communal effort to pretend the roof was not leaking. Bathhouses even had their own vocabulary. To be pickled meant staying too long to be tub-wise, meant knowing which bench was least likely to collapse. Going full splash referred to someone so enthusiastic in their bathing that others mysteriously left the room. This language changed by region, but the spirit remained the same. Shared spaces created shared stories in the end. The bathhouse was not just about washing bodies. It was about reshaping the day, scrubbing the edges off life's many small defeats. It was about shared warmth, shared water, shared humanity. No matter how imperfect, crowded, or questionably clean bathhouses mattered, they mattered because they gave people a moment of stillness, a moment of being seen, a moment when life did not smell quite so much of wet wool and despair, and that in medieval Europe was something worth soaking in the hierarchy of medieval hygiene horrors: hair washing, head lice, and herbal goop. The scalp held a special place. Hair was everywhere. It was thick, tangled, braided, concealed, revealed, prayed over, and at times weaponized with vinegar. Yet despite its prominence, caring for it was a labor of contradiction. People wanted their hair to look presentable, or at least socially passable, but they also feared what might be hiding inside it, because where there was hair, there were likely lies. And where there were lies, there was a story. The medieval approach to hair washing was cautious at best. Full shampooing, as it is understood today, was rare. Hair was washed occasionally, often during major religious festivals or before significant life events, like weddings or court appearances. For most people, clean hair meant it had been dusted, braided, and perhaps perfumed, not necessarily washed with water. When water was used, it was not applied carelessly. Hot water opened the scalp's pores, or so. It was believed, inviting in disease and disobedient spirits. Therefore, lukewarm or cold rinses were the standard. Hair was combed thoroughly before washing, sometimes for hours. Combs were made from bone wood or horn, and the act of combing was not merely for detangling, but also to dislodge lice nets and small surprises best not mentioned aloud. A popular lice treatment involved soaking the comb in vinegar or rose water. The acidity was believed to weaken the lice's grip and possibly their will to live. After combing, the hair might be washed with a herbal infusion: chamomile for shine, rosemary for strength, or nettle, if one had angered a hedge witch. Soaps were rarely applied directly to the scalp. They were too harsh and often left behind a residue that turned one's hair into a stiff, slightly flammable helmet. Those with longer hair faced added challenges. Women in particular took pride in their tresses. Braiding was both fashionable and practical. It kept the hair out of the way, contained its unruly volume, and crucially made lice easier to detect intricate. Braids could signal status, marital availability, or regional identity. Unbraided hair, on the other hand, was sometimes viewed as improper, unless one was mourning or actively cursing someone in Latin head coverings, also played a role. Most adults wore something over their heads: hats, veils, coifs, or kerchiefs, not just for modesty or fashion, but to keep dust, smoke, and wandering insects at bay. These coverings were often changed more frequently than the hair underneath was washed. In fact, if someone had a nice linen cap and a decent comb, they could go a suspiciously long time without touching a bucket. Not all treatments were gentle. Some involved rubbing the scalp with mashed garlic or onion. Others recommended goose grease, chicken fat, or warmed vinegar mixed with ash. One popular remedy included soaking bread in wine, applying it to the scalp, and leaving it there until the wine evaporated or the person was banned from social gatherings. Scholars still argue whether any of this worked, or if it simply made the lice seek out less pungent hosts. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their scalps were thinner, their habits less hygienic, and their tolerance for combing significantly lower. Parents often used herbal compresses to reduce itching or distract from the horror of what was being pulled from behind the ears. Schoolmasters sometimes inspected their pupils for lice, a process that involved wooden sticks, hard stares, and an escalating sense of shame. Monks and clergy took a different route. Their hair was often tonsured, shaved in patches as part of religious practice. This made lice easier to detect and harder to hide, which, depending on one's perspective, was either a blessing or a punishment. Even so, monasteries were not immune to infestations. Communal living, shared pillows, and vows of silence created perfect conditions for quiet, determined parasites. Hairstyling existed, but required bravery. Pomades made from animal fat, soot, or honey were applied for shine and control. These attracted both admiration and insects. One enterprising noblewoman allegedly used a paste of egg yolk and crushed herbs to create volume. It worked beautifully until a hot day turned her hair into a baked frittata that no one could unsee. Barbers offered scalp care, though their services were uneven. Some were skilled in trimming, delousing, and styling. Others leaned more toward bloodletting, tooth extraction, and unsolicited philosophy in larger towns. Barber surgeons worked out of bathhouses, cutting hair in the same steam where people whispered rumors and soaked their regrets. Dandruff was handled with dry powders, chalk-crushed eggshell, or ground herbs. The goal was to absorb oils and reduce itching, not necessarily to fix anything. Flakes were seen as part of life, like cracked hands in winter, or mysterious bruises from medieval furniture. For the truly wealthy, options expanded. Imported oils from the Mediterranean, scented waters from the East, and silk wraps to preserve hairstyles. Overnight, nobles sometimes slept on pillows stuffed with herbs to perfume the hair, as they dreamed if one could afford luxury, the hair became a canvas of ambition. If not, it remained a battlefield between beauty and bugs. Seasonal changes brought seasonal concerns in summer. Sweat and sun-turned hair, brittle in winter smoke from hearths, clung to every strand spring brought. Mud and autumn brought static. There was no escape. Even the cleanest head eventually submitted to the will of nature and its six-legged agents of chaos. Despite all this, hair was considered a vital part of personal identity. People admired thick, healthy locks. Poets wrote verses about flaxen hair and raven tresses. Saints were identified by their miraculous curls. Hair was cut and saved, offered to lovers, burned in rituals, or kept as talismans. Losing it, whether to age, illness, or lice-induced panic, was viewed as a personal defeat in literature, and legend. Hair carried symbolic weight. A knight swearing loyalty might receive a strand of his lady's hair tied around his wrist. A widow might cut her hair in mourning. A healer might require a lock to break a curse or find a missing child. Hair was not merely a cosmetic feature. It was part of the soul's packaging. And then there were wigs, not widespread in the 1200s, but occasionally used by performers, con artists, and people with something to hide. These wigs were crude, made from real hair, stitched into caps or glued onto cloth. They were itchy, heavy, and flammable. Everything one hoped for in a disguise as hygiene improved across regions. The perception of hair shifted. Clean hair became a sign of virtue. Oily hair, unless treated with perfume, was viewed as neglectful. Yet the practicalities remained. Without easy access to water, soap, and time, most people did what they could. They combed, they braided, they wrapped, they hoped. Some wore talismans in their hair, tiny pouches with herbs, charms, or bits of parchment. These were meant to ward off disease, misfortune, or nosy neighbors. A hairdo could be both fashion statement and spiritual armor, all held together with pins carved from bone. Even in death, hair mattered. Corpses were sometimes buried with combs, their hair washed with holy water and brushed by grieving relatives. This final grooming was a sign of dignity, a preparation for whatever awaited beyond. Because whether alive or departed, medieval person understood one truth. The state of your scalp said something about your soul. In the end, hair hygiene was less about perfection and more about effort. It was a battlefield, a ritual, a burden, and a badge. It itched, it tangled, it rebelled. But it also spoke of care of identity and of the enduring desire to face the world with a head held high. even if there was something crawling on it. Tooth powder, chew sticks, and rotten gums. If you ever find yourself grateful for modern dental floss, spare a thought for the medieval mouth. The state of oral hygiene in the 1200s was less a science and more a stubborn act of survival. Teeth were important. They were used for cutting food, cracking nuts, and occasionally biting one's enemies, but their care was wildly inconsistent, experimental, and frequently painful. Most people cleaned their teeth in some way. It was not a matter of total neglect, but of limited understanding. Toothbrushes as they exist today did not appear in Europe until centuries later. Instead, medieval people used chewing sticks. Twigs from aromatic trees like hazel licorice or walnut, one end of the stick, was frayed into a brush-like texture. This would be rubbed against the teeth in repetitive strokes, ideally dislodging food particles, layers of plaque, and perhaps the previous week's regrets. To complement the chew stick, people sometimes used cloth. A scrap of linen wrapped around the finger could be dipped in a cleansing mixture and used to scrub the teeth directly. The mixtures varied by region and bravado. A popular one included crushed charcoal and salt. Others blended dried mint, rosemary ash, and occasionally powdered bone. These powders served to scour the teeth, leaving behind a surface that felt cleaner and looked somewhat more matte. Of course, these powders were abrasive. Regular use could wear down enamel, but this was not well understood. People valued the sensation of a clean mouth more than long-term structural integrity. If the teeth looked white and felt smooth, that was considered a success. Even if the gums had begun to recede like a timid rabbit in a thunderstorm, halitosis or bad breath was a social concern. Remedies were numerous. Chewing parsley was common. So was sucking on cloves, anise seeds, or fennel. Wealthier individuals might carry pomanders, small ornate balls filled with perfumed herbs to hold near their face during conversation. Others chewed cardamom, pods or pieces of dried ginger, not only to sweeten the breath, but to mask the underlying scent of fermented onions. And dental despair dentistry existed, but it was crude. Toothaches were treated first with poultices. Onion juice, vinegar, and mashed leeks were applied directly to the gum. Clove oil, where available, was treasured for its numbing effect. If these methods failed, the tooth was extracted. There were no anesthetics. The extraction was performed by a barber surgeon or whoever was brave enough to hold the pliers and not flinch at screaming extraction tools were terrifying. The dental key resembled a miniature meat hook, designed to wrench the offending tooth free with a twist. In skilled hands, The process was brutal, but quick. In unskilled hands, the patient risked broken teeth, shattered jawbones, and lifelong suspicion of anyone holding metal. Preventative dentistry was mostly based on superstition. Some believed worms caused toothaches. These invisible invaders were thought to bore into the enamel and feast to drive them out. People smoked their mouths with burning henbane garlic or other foul-smelling herbs. The goal was to suffocate the worms or at least chase them toward someone less annoying. Diet played a role in dental health. Unlike today, sugar was rare and extremely expensive. Honey was the primary sweetener, and though it could contribute to decay, it was not as destructive as the imported cane sugar that later ravaged Renaissance's molars. The medieval diet consisted largely of coarse bread, porridge, vegetables, and meat, all of which required serious chewing. This helped keep the jaw strong and may have clean teeth naturally to a point. However, the bread often contained grit from millstones. Tiny stone fragments mixed into flour wore down the teeth over time. This abrasion could lead to exposed nerves and infections combined with the lack of antibiotics. Such infections could become fatal. A simple cavity could turn into a slow burning death sentence. Delivered via the bloodstream, gum disease was also widespread. Swollen, bleeding gums were considered normal. Past a certain age, some tried to treat this with vinegar rinses or by rubbing the gums with crushed mint. Others relied on prayer. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, received many whispered requests from desperate peasants, clutching their swollen cheeks and bargaining with heaven for one more pain-free morning. Tooth loss was common and expected. Young adults might have a full smile, but by middle age, gaps began to appear. False teeth did exist, but were rare. Some were made from bone or ivory and tied in with cords. Others were repurposed from the teeth of animals or unfortunate humans. These replacements were uncomfortable and mostly ornamental, worn by nobles for court appearances and quickly removed afterward with a grimace. Despite these obstacles, people did smile. They joked about bad breath, made fun of each other's whistling gaps, and occasionally gifted dental remedies wrapped in cloth tooth powders were given as tokens of affection. Mint sprigs were exchanged like breath mints. Couples might chew herbs together before a feast, knowing full well that roasted garlic was waiting on the table. Oral hygiene, while not scientific, was cultural. It reflected the values of the time. People cared how they smelled. They cared what others saw. They cared whether their smile was passable, even if it took sand, vinegar, and stubborn denial to get there. It was a system built on intuition, trial and error, and a healthy dose of collective bravery. Monasteries contributed to dental care through their herbal knowledge. Monks cultivated gardens filled with sage, mint, and hyssop plants, believed to strengthen the gums and soothe pain. Manuscripts recorded remedies for mouth rot, tooth demons, and hot teeth, which modern historians interpret as everything from gingivitis to full abscesses. Treatments included gargling with warmed wine, applying herbal poultices, or simply fasting and hoping for divine intervention. In towns, traveling tooth pullers were both feared and welcomed. These men arrived with bags of tools and flamboyant coats promising relief and entertainment. They set up in markets, offered free consultations, and extracted teeth while playing music or telling stories. Children watched in horror. Adults waited their turn, hoping the spectacle would distract from the agony. Illustrations from the period show grotesque caricatures of these men, yanking teeth while their victims screamed and flailed, and yet the tooth pullers remained in business. Pain, after all, was part of the human condition. If someone could end it, even briefly, they were forgiven for their eccentric fashion and questionable ethics. Tooth charms were common. Some people wore teeth from animals around their necks to ward off decay. Others carried written spells or hung small bones near the bed to protect against nighttime jaw pain. These practices were half medicine, half superstition. No one really knew how teeth worked, but everyone agreed they hurt spectacularly when they failed. By modern standards, medieval dental hygiene was a nightmare, but judged by the tools and beliefs of the time, it was a strange form of perseverance. People did not give up on their teeth. They fought back with herbs, sticks, powder, prayer, and the occasional scream muffled by a linen rag. There is a kind of beauty in that, in the absence of modern toothpaste, ergonomic brushes, and dental insurance. Medieval people made do. They worked with what they had. They improvised. They endured. And when the pain became unbearable, they sought out the man with the iron hook and a firm grip. Even that, in its terrifying way, was a form of self-care. If medieval hygiene had a face, it probably shimmered faintly. Skin care with mercury and mouse. Fat from a concoction involving crushed pearls, spoiled milk, and something that smelled vaguely like roasted rodent skin care in the 1200s was a mixture of superstition, trial and error, chemistry, and dangerous optimism. People wanted to look healthy. The problem was no one quite agreed on what health looked like or how much mercury was. Too much. Pale skin was in fashion. It signified wealth, leisure, and the privilege of staying indoors while peasants baked in the fields. Tanned skin was associated with labor and low status. So naturally, people did everything in their power to appear pale, even if it meant coating themselves with lead literally. One popular preparation was Venetian ceruse, a skin whitener made from white lead mixed with vinegar applied to the face. It gave a ghostly matte finish that practically screamed, "I am rich," elegant, and possibly already dying over time. The lead absorbed into the skin, causing muscle weakness, facial tremors, and in many cases, permanent scarring. The irony was profound. The more beautiful someone tried to appear, the more their face peeled like old wallpaper. Another favored ingredient was mercury, yes, the shiny, silvery poison that makes modern scientists flinch, was used in creams and salves. It was believed to treat skin infections, remove spots, and smooth imperfections in practice. It also removed portions of sanity, as mercury exposure, LED, to neurological damage. Users might lose coordination, memory, or the ability to finish a sentence without blinking in Morse code. Still, these ingredients were prized recipes, were passed among noble women, stored in little books alongside love charms and pickle brines. Some skin treatments called for egg white masks. Others used crushed rose petals mixed with chalk. Goat milk was rubbed into cheeks for softness. Bread soaked in ale was applied to sunburns. If it sounded remotely edible, someone tried rubbing it on their face mouse. That had its moment. It was mixed with powdered sage and applied to dry patches or used to soften calluses. Some texts suggest mouse fat worked best when rendered from a black mouse during a full moon, but that probably had more to do with theatrical flair than scientific accuracy. Still, someone somewhere rubbed mouse fat onto their forehead and told their friends it worked wonders. Honey was more respectable. It was used to treat wounds and moisturize skin. It had antibacterial properties and a sweet scent. Unfortunately, it also attracted insects, bees, ants, and anything else with a nose. The brave persisted, insisting that being chased by hornets was a small price. For radiant skin oil was a staple olive oil. If one could afford it, was pressed for hydration. Almond oil was used in perfumed balms. Even animal fats rendered from pigs, ducks, or the aforementioned mice was smeared onto dry limbs. These fats were often scented with herbs to mask their natural enthusiasm. Scrubs existed. Ground seeds, flour, crushed eggshells, or ashes were mixed into pastes and used to exfoliate. The goal was to remove dead skin and reveal the smoother layer beneath. In practice, the results varied. Some emerged glowing, others emerged raw, blotchy, and questioning their life choices. Son, protection was more spiritual than scientific. Some believed that amulets or prayers could prevent sunburn. Others used physical barriers, wide hoods, veils, or hats with flaps. Those who could afford parasols employed them in summer. Peasants used whatever was available: shawls, baskets. The nearest chicken, anything to keep the sun off their face freckles, were unpopular among the wealthy. They were associated with exposure and were often targeted with bleaching treatments. Lemon juice was dabbed onto spots, as was vinegar mixed with salt. One remedy involved applying the blood of a rabbit killed during a lunar eclipse. Historians still argue whether this did anything useful. Aside from making people feel committed, warts, blemishes, and moles had complicated reputations. In some regions, a mole on the face was a mark of luck. In others, it was a sign of witchcraft. Remedies for removing them included burning with heated iron, cutting them with knives, or applying herbal poultices made from crushed plantain leaves. Occasionally, people just ignored them and wore larger hats. Acne was treated with everything from boiled cabbage water to powdered coral. The understanding of skin conditions was limited, so most treatments aimed to draw out heat or cool the blood. Mint was popular for this. So was crushed cucumber, though more often as an excuse to put lunch on your face. Scarring was an unfortunate reality, whether from smallpox injury or previous beauty experiments gone wrong. Facial scars were common. Some tried to conceal them with wax-based balms. Others wore veils or face cloths. In certain circles, a scar was considered noble, a sign of surviving plague or battle. In others, it was a blemish to be hidden at any cost. Perfume was often used to distract from skin condition. Floral waters, especially rose and lavender, were dabbed behind the ears or across the wrists. Scented sachets were tucked into clothing. Soap, when it existed, was more for smell than function. A bar of rose-scented soap might never touch water. It sat in a drawer, quietly judging the rest of your hygiene. Men were not exempt, while most did not wear face cream openly. Many applied ointments for sunburn, shaving rash, or battlefield injuries. Knights carried herbal balms in their kits. Hunters rubbed crushed juniper onto their cheeks for good fortune and fewer insect bites. Squires sometimes inherited skin treatments along with armor polish and debt. Aging was accepted, though often delayed, with creative effort. Wrinkles were massaged with warm oil. Gray hairs were dyed with plant tinctures. Henna Walnut shells and iron filings soaked in vinegar made passable hair dye. If one could tolerate the smell, youthfulness was not necessarily the goal. Looking like you had not been kicked by Tim was good enough. Interestingly, people often associated skin quality with morality. Smooth, pale skin implied piety, cleanliness, and discipline. Rough, sun-darkened skin suggested impulsiveness or sin. This led to unfortunate stereotypes, where peasants were viewed as less pure simply for having functional melanin and outdoor responsibilities. Monasteries contributed to skincare through herbal knowledge. Monks and nuns kept records of salves, balms, and poultices made from garden-grown ingredients. Calendula, sage, yarrow, and comfrey were common. Some monastic recipes survived today, offering a surprisingly sensible approach to treating burns, rashes, and bug bites, but for all the effort, skincare was deeply inconsistent. What worked for one person gave another a rash. What soothed one face scorched another. Remedies were based on humoral theory, balancing hot, cold, moist, and dry. If your skin was too hot, you needed a cooling treatment. If too dry, you needed fat. If your nose turned blue, you probably needed to lie down and rethink your choices. And yet people cared. They fussed. They compared. They shared advice that had been passed down from grandmothers, healers, and traveling merchants. They stared into polished copper mirrors and poked at blemishes. They plucked stray hairs with bone tweezers. They lit candles and examined their faces, not with vanity, but with curiosity and stubborn hope. Because even in an age without dermatology, there was still a desire to feel good in one's skin. Even if that skin was partially covered in lard and smelled faintly of lavender and regret. In the 1200s, clothes were less about expression. Clothes washed monthly, worn daily, and more about survival. A tunic was not just a fashion choice. It was insulation, modesty, bedding, napkin, handkerchief, towel, and sometimes a blanket, for your goat people owned very few garments, often just one or two sets total. And when something had to do that much work, it did not get washed very often. Certainly not every week, and usually not even every month. Washing clothes was hard. It involved hauling water, heating it if possible, and scrubbing the fabric with sand, lye, or ashes. There were no detergents, no washing machines, and no such thing as a gentle cycle. Everything was done by hand, outdoors in whatever basin or river could be claimed for the afternoon. This was not a chore. This was an ordeal. Clothes were washed when they became visibly filthy, smelled like a livestock parade, or developed their own political opinions. Linen undergarments. If someone could afford aboard them were the most frequently cleaned items. These were worn close to the skin and absorbed sweat and oils. A linen shirt might be washed a few times per month. Overclothes like wool tunics were rarely cleaned. Wool was thick, difficult to dry, and prone to shrinking. Instead of washing it, people aired it out, beat the dust out with sticks, or hung it over burning herbs in hopes that the smoke would do what soap could not. Drying clothes was another challenge. There were no laundry lines strung between manicured hedges. Clothes were laid out on bushes, hedgerows, or flat stones. Sometimes they were hung over wooden fences and occasionally over livestock. Pens, which led to situations where a sheep absconded with someone's only pair of breeches soap were available, was harsh. It was made from animal fat and lye, and it stung the hands. Washwomen developed calluses thick enough to knock on doors with some used ash or even fermented urine as a cleansing agent. Yes, urine, it contains ammonia and was considered highly effective, particularly for linen. Collecting it was a social task. No one volunteered. For twice, clothing repair was more common than washing a garment would be patched, restitched, and reinforced long before it would be properly cleaned. Needles and thread were valuable. A family might share a single needle guarded with the same intensity as a blessed relic. Darning socks was an evening activity. Adding a patch was a sign of thrift, not shame. A tunic with 5 different fabrics stitched into it was not an eyesore. It was a timeline. Dyes were unreliable. Most everyday clothing was in shades of brown, gray, or faded earth tones. Brighter colors required expensive ingredients. Indigo for blue, woad for a cheaper version of blue, madder for red. These dyes faded quickly, ran when wet, and occasionally poisoned the wearer if improperly prepared. Still, people tried. Even a weak yellow made from onion skins was preferable to the standard potato fog aesthetic. Most villages wore sumptuary laws dictated what colors or fabrics certain classes could wear in some regions. Peasants were forbidden from wearing specific shades or from using silk, even if they somehow acquired it. This was less about economics and more about keeping everyone in their social lane. A poor man in red might be accused of trying to impersonate a noble. A rich man in plain wool might be praised for humility or suspected of hiding from debt collectors. Washing days were communal events. Women gathered at rivers or wells, scrubbing clothes on flat stones or primitive washboards. They gossiped, exchanged recipes, and tried not to let toddlers fall into the water. Songs were often sung during washing. part tradition, part rhythm, aid and part attempt to drown out the complaints of aching backs and numb hands. Wool, when it was washed, had to be handled carefully. Hot water would shrink it. Cold water did nothing. The process was a delicate dance of temperature control, beating, soaking, and praying. Many people simply avoided the process entirely. A wool tunic might go unwashed for a year, aired occasionally, and brushed down with a stiff straw broom. Clothing storage was minimal. Most households did not have wardrobes or chests. Clothes were folded or rolled and placed in shelves, pegs, or under beds. Some hung their garments from rafters, where smoke from the fire theoretically kept pests away. Others bundled their spare clothes into sacks and sat on them. Multi-purpose furniture was a medieval standard. Undergarments were more common among the upper classes. A noble woman might wear a linen shift beneath her gown, both for comfort and to protect the outer garment from body oils. These shifts were often embroidered, at least along the neckline and cuffs, so they could peek out without looking plain. These inner layers were the ones washed most often, leading to the illusion that the person was generally cleaner than they actually were. Footwear was another matter entirely. Shoes were rarely cleaned. They were made of leather, cloth, or wood, and were expected to absorb their fair share of the landscape. Some were lined with fur, some were stuffed with straw. Most were passed down, reshaped, or worn until holes outnumbered stitches. Clean shoes were a luxury. Most were simply dried when wet and knocked against a wall to evict whatever had moved in wealthier homes. Laundry was the domain of servants. These were usually women tasked with the back-breaking job of scrubbing, boiling, wringing, and drying garments for entire households. The smell of laundry day in a castle courtyard was distinctive. Hot wool, scorched lye, and lavender, fighting a losing battle. If a noble woman smelled sweet and looked radiant, it was because several other women were standing waist deep in a soapy trough, swearing under their breath. Clothes also carried symbolism. A clean tunic at church suggested moral order. A ragged hemline might speak of hardship or humility. Bright embroidery could signal wealth, lineage, or local pride. Certain motifs were passed down through families. Geometric patterns planned. Symbols or animals stitched into collars and cuffs. A shirt could be a canvas, a message, or a shield for children. Clothes were often made from scrap. Babies were swaddled in whatever linen could be spared as they grew. They inherited clothes from older siblings, neighbors, or the deceased. Hand-me-downs were not a sign of poverty. They were a sign of being included in a long, fraying lineage of thread. In winter, layers were added rather than replaced. People piled on cloaks, mantles, shawls, and caps. There was no expectation of clean garments. The goal was warmth. And if that meant smelling like a sheep that had fallen into a chimney, so be it. In summer layers were shed, but only to a point modesty mattered. Even a peasant sweating in the fields wore sleeves and head coverings, more for sun protection and cultural norms than fashion. Despite the grime and repetition, clothes were cared for. People took pride in mending and brushing out stains and arranging their few possessions neatly. A folded tunic could feel like order. A fresh linen shift, even if slightly damp from drying too close to the fear, could feel like renewal. In a world where most things decayed quickly, fabric held memory. Stitches marked effort. Faded colors whispered of sun, soap, and survival. If you walk through a 13th century town, the fragrance of the 13th century with your nose in the air, you might regret it almost immediately. Medieval fragrance was not just a matter of preference. It was survival scent, carried meaning, masked sins, and functioned as both social signal and olfactory armor. A person's smell said more about them than their clothes or their accent. And sometimes it said things they really wished it would not. At the base level, everyone had a smell. Bathing was rare. Laundry was rarer. People lived close together with their animals, cooked indoors over smoky fires, and went to the toilet wherever gravity allowed. The result was a thick, layered scentscape that lingered in clothing, hair, and walls. It was not just dirt or sweat. It was humanity in its most aromatic form. To fight this, people turned to herbs. Lavender, rosemary, sage, and mint were the stars of the medieval scent world. Bundles of these herbs were hung from rafters, tucked into pillows, or sewn into sachets that were worn under clothing. A sachet might contain dried petals, cinnamon bark, clove, or even a shard of resin. These were not just for fragrance. They were considered protection against disease, against bad luck, and occasionally against other people. Pomanders were popular among the upper classes. These were hollow, often spherical containers made of precious metal worn on belts or hung from necklaces. Hence it was a mixture of strongly scented substances: ambergris, musk, civet, and floral oils. Ambergris came from the digestive system of whales. Musk came from glands of animals no one wanted to meet twice. Civet came from cat-like creatures who surely did not appreciate the extraction process despite their origins. These ingredients were highly prized and sold at high prices. When mixed properly, they produced scents that were earthy, warm, and extremely good at masking the smell of damp wool and questionable decisions. Herbs were also burned. This was called fumigation, and it was both a cleaning ritual and an air freshener. Juniper, frankincense, and myrrh were burned in homes, churches, and even on the street. The smoke was believed to cleanse the air, drive away disease, and lift spirits. It also covered the smell of rotting food, chamber pots, and livestock. Traffic jams, clothing could be perfumed too. Wealthier people sometimes owned perfume gloves, scented with floral oils or powdered spices. Linen handkerchiefs were infused with rosewater. Cloaks might be lined with sachets stitched discreetly into the seams. In some cases, entire rooms were perfumed by boiling orange peels or cloves on the hearth. And it was not just about covering scent. Certain smells were believed to protect the body, disease especially. Plague was thought to travel through bad air miasma. If one kept sweet-smelling herbs near the face, one could purify the air before it reached the lungs. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing the beak would filter illness. Citizens with fewer resources simply stuffed lavender into their sleeves and hoped for the best hygiene rituals. Had their own scent rules. After washing, people might rub their skin with scented oil both to soften the skin and to impart fragrance. Popular scents included rose, almond, and violet. These oils were usually infused at home, made by steeping petals in olive or nut oils and storing them in glass or ceramic containers. Bottles were reused, and the smell intensified over time. For better or worse, homes were often scented intentionally or not. Rushes and herbs were strewn across the floor in noble homes, providing a form of carpet and a constant underfoot fragrance. These rushes were changed semi-regularly, but the smell of crushed herbs, along with whatever fell onto the floor, created a unique household signature. Some homes smelled of sage and roast meat. Others smelled like mildew and ambition. Markets, too, had signature scents. The butcher's stall, the fishmonger's bucket, the herb vendor's wares, the baker's smoke. Each street corner carried its own perfume for medieval townspeople. Navigation was a sensory experience. You could find your way home by smell alone, provided the wind was cooperating, and no one had dumped something unspeakable into the gutter. Seasonality affected fragrance in spring. The street smelled of mud, flowers, and sheep in summer. The scent of sweat mixed with ripe fruit and slightly less ripe neighbors. Autumn brought the earthy perfume of fallen leaves, fermenting cider, and decaying market. Leftovers. Winter was a season of smoke, damp cloaks, and whatever scent had embedded itself in your scarf since last washing. Personal scent was part of courtship. A pleasant smell could be more persuasive than flattering. Poem lovers exchanged scented tokens, handkerchiefs, sprigs of mint, locks of hair wrapped in rosemary. A well-perfumed visitor might be welcomed more warmly. A foul-smelling, One might be offered the guest stool nearest the door. Scent could also be weaponized. Enemies might be accused of carrying bad luck through foul body odor. People suspected of witchcraft were sometimes described as having unnatural or lingering scents. Conversely, saints were said to emit floral scents even in death, a sign of purity, known as the odor of sanctity. Stories circulated of corpses that smelled of roses, despite having been in the ground for weeks. The implication was divine favor, or at least impressive posthumous hygiene. Religious rituals included scent incense was burned during mass ceremonies and processions. The fragrance was meant to lift prayers heavenward and create a sensory boundary between the sacred and the mundane for peasants in the back of the church. The incense also served to mask the smell of the crowd, which was its own act of grace. Children were an unpredictable olfactory element. Babies were swaddled in layers of fabric that were not changed. Often, herbs were sometimes tucked into these layers to offset the effects of nature. Mothers chewed mint or fennel before breastfeeding, believing the scent would calm the child or sweeten the milk. Some infants wore garlands of rosemary, partly for blessing, partly to make them more tolerable on long walks. Animals contributed to the medieval scent: map, horses, oxen, chickens, goats, each with their own earthy presence, were part of the household. Literally, in some homes, livestock slept indoors during winter. Their smells blended with smoke, straw, and wet wool into a perfume that was oddly comforting if you had grown up with it, and horrifying if you had not. There were class differences in scent. Nobility had access to imported spices, perfumed waters, and bathing facilities. Their scent profiles were floral, resinous, or citrusy. The poor smelled of work, smoke, and the world. But even they took steps to improve their aroma. A peasant might not have rose water, but he had mint from the yard, a clean shirt warmed by the fire, and the resolve to stand down when, from judgment, scent rituals marked life's milestones. Births were blessed with incense. Weddings were celebrated with flower garlands. Funerals involved burning herbs to send off the soul and keep the living from fainting. Each major event had a smell, remembered long after the details faded, and so fragrance was not a luxury. It was a thread running through daily life, binding identity, health, belief, and memory. People in the 13th century lived surrounded by scent, shaped by it, defended by it. They wore it like armor, traded it like treasure, feared it like poison. In the end, no one in medieval Europe smelled like a daisy, but some carried daisies anyway, tucked behind an ear or sewn into a cuff, hoping that beauty might triumph over biology, if only for a moment. In the 1200s, feet were not sacred, they were not delicate, they were foot care, fungus, and the no-sock life not discussed in poems or admired in portraits. Feet were instruments of labor, battered, calloused, and often ignored until something went very wrong. They carried people across fields into markets, over thresholds, and through entire pilgrimages, without complaint, or at least without complaint, anyone listened to footwear. When available was crude. Most shoes were little more than stitched leather coverings, shaped like the foot, but offering minimal protection. They had thin soles, soft sides, and about as much arch support as a folded cabbage leaf. A cobbler could make a pair to measure, but the result still felt like a compromise between a shoe and a question mark socks as we know them. Did not exist for the average person wealthy. Individuals might own hose close-fitting leg coverings made of wool or linen, but these often left the foot bare or only partially enclosed. Most people relied on foot wraps, strips of cloth, wound around the feet and ankles. These added warmth and softness, but had to be rewound regularly or risked bunching, shifting, or causing painful blisters. A poorly applied foot wrap could turn a walk to the mill into a week-long limp straw. Moss or even feathers were sometimes stuffed into shoes as insulation. These materials soaked up sweat, then marinated quietly until removed, discarded, or replaced. The term fresh was relative. If the straw had dried overnight near the hearth, that counted. Shoes were not waterproof leather, absorbed moisture, and seams leaked. A rainy day meant soggy shoes, which meant soggy feet, which meant cold toes, and eventually a round of herbal treatments for whatever fungal empire had taken hold. People tried greasing their shoes with animal fat, beeswax, or pitch to repel water. The result was often temporary success, followed by ruined floors, sticky ankles, or goats nibbling the soles. Podiatric health was reactive when feet hurt. They were treated until then they were ignored. Cuts were cleaned with wine or vinegar. Bruises were wrapped in warm cloth. Sores were lanced and drained with knives that had also carved breakfast. There was no such thing as preventive care unless one counted mumbling a quick prayer before stepping into a muddy lane full of broken tiles and judgment blisters, were managed with poultices, honey and ash mashed herbs, or bits of wool soaked in beer. The beer treatment was particularly popular, though it is unclear whether it worked or simply distracted the sufferer. Until the swelling subsided for chronic foot pain, people visited local healers who prescribed warm foot baths with rosemary or thyme. Some included bloodletting, on the logic that removing excess fluids would balance the body. Others simply advised rest, elevation, or failing. All else traveling to a distant monastery, rumored to possess a sandal from Saint Sebastian. Cracked heels were so common they barely registered as a problem. The skin dried, split, and healed repeatedly. Some rubbed in animal fat or beeswax to soften the fissures. Others tied pieces of raw cabbage over the area. If it worked, it worked. If not, the cabbage was repurposed for dinner, and the cracks were simply endured. Toenail care was a personal matter. Nails were trimmed with knives chipped with rocks, or bitten by those with flexible morals and a good sense of balance. Overgrown nails lead to more serious problems: curled growth infections, ingrown disasters. Treatment ranged from cutting away the offending nail to wrapping it in vinegar-soaked cloth until it surrendered or fell off from embarrassment. Foot odor was accepted as a fact of life. People washed their feet with mint water or rubbed them with sage or crushed pine needles. The results lasted about an hour, after which the natural scent of labor and survival reasserted itself. There were jokes, of course. The road follows his feet because it fears the smell and other cheerful barbs, but truly, offensive odor was a matter of community concern. People might leave gifts of herbs, suggest a foot bath, or if desperate, avoid eye contact entirely. Children's feet were often bare. Especially in summer, they ran through meadows, dung heaps, and shallow streams. Cuts and scrapes were constant. Parents checked for signs of infection, redness, swelling, warmth, or unexplained curses. Remedies included soaking the foot in boiled plant water or rubbing it with oil and murmured prayers. Stories of foot-blessing saints were told at bedtime, partly to comfort and partly to distract from the bleeding in wealthier households. Foot care included bathing ointments and even massage. Servants soaked their master's feet in warm water infused with flower petals. The feet were then dried with linen and rubbed with almond oil or balm made from goose fat and lavender. This ritual was both cleansing and symbolic. Clean feet signified control, status, and leisure, the ability to rest while others worked. Shoemaking was both craft and art. Cobblers shaped soles, stitched uppers, and patched tears. They used wooden last foot-shaped molds to build consistency. Nails, glue, and binding cords held the pieces together. A good cobbler could make a shoe that lasted several seasons. A great one could craft footwear worthy of a wedding, a festival, or a particularly demanding bishop. Shoes reflected status. Pointed shoes, often wildly impractical, were all the rage among nobility. some curled at the toe. Others were so long they needed to be tied to the leg to avoid tripping. These shoes were not made for walking, they were made for watching others walk. Religious attitudes toward feet were paradoxical. On one hand, feet were humble, earthly dirty on the other. They were spiritual. Washing feet was an act of reverence in monasteries. Monks performed this ritual regularly, both to cleanse and to display humility. Pilgrims received foot washings at sacred sites. Christ, washing his disciples' feet, was a foundational image that echoed through churches, sermons, and the occasional awkward dinner. Invitation medieval literature rarely mentioned feet unless something went wrong. A knight might be described as fleet-footed, but rarely was his footwear discussed unless it broke or bled. Commoners' feet were mentioned in legal records, usually when injured during disputes involving livestock carts or overly enthusiastic maypole dances. Travelers faced particular challenges. Long distance walking over rough terrain meant constant wear. Pilgrims suffered cracked heels, sprains, and bruised soles. They padded their shoes with wool, replaced worn soles with stitched-on patches, and relied on rest stops to soak their aching feet in communal tubs. Some wore sandals made of rope or bark. Others simply went barefoot as a form of devotion or desperation. Foot deformities were often left untreated. Bunions, collapsed arches, and hammer toes were seen as normal signs of age or misfortune. Folk remedies abounded, wrapping the feet in cloth soaked in rabbit blood, reciting chants under moonlight, or pressing a toad to the sole and offering it a song. Effectiveness varied. The toad was usually unimpressed. Despite all this, feet carried on. They carried people to weddings, to funerals, to markets, and to war they stomped in. Celebration shuffled in sorrow and marched toward destiny with whatever protection could be fashioned from leather, wool, and willpower. In the end, the medieval foot was not beautiful. It was not praised, but it was respected quietly, reluctantly, and often through the simple act of washing, drying, and walking once more. If there was one aspect of medieval life, going to the toilet, if you must, that modern time travelers would struggle with most, it might be the toilet situation, or rather the frequent absence of anything resembling one bodily functions did not stop. In the 1200s, they simply adapted, often in creative, unsettling, and deeply communal ways. Sanitation was more of a suggestion than a system, and privacy was usually traded for immediacy. Let us begin with the medieval equivalent of the bathroom, the guardrobe in castles and fortified manors. This was a small stone room built into the exterior wall, usually projecting out slightly above a moat or courtyard. Inside was a wooden bench with a hole cut into it. The waste dropped down a vertical shaft, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes directly into the open air, and sometimes, distressingly, onto a lower level of the building. If architectural planning had taken a day off, in theory, the guardrobe provided a degree of privacy. In practice, it was a cold, drafty hole where the wind howled upwards with unholy intent. Many guardrobes were built high for convenience of gravity, not safety, which made using them in the dark a test of both aim and existential courage. The smell was permanent. Castle walls absorbed everything. Attempts were made to reduce odors, placing herbs like lavender or mint near the seat, hanging bunches of rosemary or stuffing straw into cracks. Lime was occasionally tossed down the shaft to neutralize the worst of it. Whether this helped or simply gave the user something to hope for remains debatable for those living in towns or rural homes. The options were humbler. Most used chamber pots. These ceramic or wooden bowls were kept under the bed or in a corner. They were used at night during storms or when walking to the communal latrine was deemed too much of an adventure. In the morning, the contents were dumped sometimes into designated cesspits, more often out a window with a yell of warning that may or may not have been delivered with enthusiasm. Yes, the infamous guard, Leo French, for watch out for the water, was a real thing. So were the unfortunate pedestrians who failed to heed it. Streets were narrow drainage, poor and footwear-absorbent people learned to walk close to buildings and wear long cloaks with hemline regret. Public latrines did exist in larger towns, often near rivers. These were open air or semi-enclosed structures, sometimes with separate sections for men and women. They were cleaned sporadically and used enthusiastically. Waste flowed into the river, which also supplied drinking water, thus creating a circular ecosystem of increasingly poor decisions. Wiping materials varied. Wealthy individuals might use cloth, which was then washed by someone else, and reused. The poor used what was available: moss, hay, straw, wool clumps, or even smooth stones in coastal areas. Mussel shells were not unheard of, though their comfort level is best left unexamined. Some relied on the left hand and water, a practice with long cultural roots and socials. Implications to shake with the left hand was considered offensive for a reason. Toilet paper as such did not exist in Europe. The idea of using paper for personal hygiene would have been seen as wasteful, especially when parchment and paper was so expensive. Books were rare. Nothing printed was considered disposable. One does not wipe with the Gospel of John, even if it is written in Latin and contains confusing grammar. The design of toilets evolved slowly. Monasteries often had communal latrines with running water channeled beneath, using nearby streams. These were among the most advanced sanitation systems of the time, and monastic rules sometimes included scheduled cleaning rotations, making them more hygienic than most noble estates in some towns. Cesspits were dug behind houses. These were covered and uncovered as needed when full. They were emptied by individuals known as gong farmers. This was a real job, and it paid surprisingly well due to the sheer unpleasantness involved gong. Farmers worked at night scooping waste into barrels and carting it outside city limits. They were required to live separately, often near rivers or wastelands, because the smell clung to them with remarkable loyalty, despite their unglamorous work. Gong. Farmers were essential without them. Streets backed up, homes flooded, and diseases spread even faster than gossip. They were the quiet backbone of urban hygiene, shoveling filth, while the rest of society pretended not to notice. Diseases linked to poor sanitation were common. Dysentery, cholera, and parasitic infections plagued communities. Flies were constant, rats ever present. And the concept of a clean food preparation surface existed only in theory. Food and excrement coexisted dangerously close together. People tried to mitigate this with herbs boiling, and prayer water was often avoided in favor of beer or wine. Not for fun, but because fermentation killed things that rivers did not. Toileting was not always solitary in monasteries and public latrines, multiple holes lined up side by side with little to no separation. Conversations occurred, debates raged, silence was not enforced. One entered the latrine with dignity and excited with stories sometimes shared far too loudly. Over dinner, children were trained early. Toddlers were given miniature chamber pots. Older children were taught to dump waste properly, or at least not into the laundry basin. Accidents happened. Discipline followed. Occasionally, so did rats. Rats liked warmth. Darkness and food remnant. Medieval toilets provided all three, and there are records of unfortunate encounters involving startled anatomy and deeply traumatized families. Toileting while traveling presented special challenges. Pilgrims used roadside bushes, streams, or designated comfort areas outside town. Some carried small folding stools with holes in them. A primitive porta potty for the devout soldiers dug trenches. Nobles brought portable chamber pots. A clever merchant might carry aromatic herbs to mask the smell. which also served to ward off conversation. Disposal of waste was everyone's problem. Some cities had laws about when waste could be dumped. Enforcement was inconsistent. Penalties ranged from fines to public shaming. More often, people simply lived with the smells and hoped for a good wind in winter. Frozen waste piled up in alleys. In spring, it thawed. Nothing in medieval Europe smelled quite like spring. There was humor, too. Medieval jokes often referenced bodily functions. Plays featured fart gags. Poems hinted at unfortunate noises from the back row of the pew. One manuscript contains a recipe for a potion to silence the wind, involving boiled leeks and very specific prayer timing. No one knows if it worked, but the attempt speaks volumes in the end. Toileting in the 1200s was neither refined nor comfortable. It was pragmatic, improvisational, and remarkably effective. Given the tools, people did what they could. They built high towers to drop waste far away. They dug pits and hired men with strong backs and no sense of smell. They burned herbs, said prayers, and avoided looking down too often, because in the medieval world, cleanliness began. With creativity and sometimes a strong stomach. If the medieval toilet, medical hygiene, leeches, and boiled instruments was a crisis of architecture, medieval medicine was a crisis of confidence. Hygiene in the context of healthcare was not a given. It was, at best, an aspiration. Medical treatment in the 1200s hovered somewhere between hopeful witchcraft and experimental carpentry. Instruments were sharp explanations, vague, and the chance of infection almost guaranteed. Let us begin with the tools. Scalpels, forceps, lancets, and needles were used repeatedly and rarely cleaned between patients. When they were cleaned, it was usually with wine, vinegar, or if the practitioner was feeling cautious. Boiling water was a serious commitment. It meant starting a fire, fetching a pot, heating it to the point of bubbling, menace, and then maybe dunking the blood-stained blade inside for a moment before drying it on a sleeve. Surgeons wore no gloves. There were no surgical gowns. They worked in tunics mirrored with history. Their hands were rinsed. Only if visibly crusted blood was removed with rags, snow, or a corner of the tablecloth. Surgical surfaces, if they existed, were wooden planks or kitchen tables, scrubbed only if the last patient had been. Especially memorable wounds were packed with moss, herbs, or lint. Moss was favored for its absorbency and availability. Honey, when accessible, was used to seal wounds and discourage infection. It worked better than many alternatives, though no one knew why. Wounds that festered were poulticed with garlic, onion, or warm bread mashed with beer. if it still smelled wrong, after that, it was time for prayer. Leeches were standard fare. Physicians kept them in jars ready to apply at the slightest mention of excess blood. Leeches did not care about the reason, they just latched on and did their work. They were placed behind ears, on the arms, or on any spot deemed congested. They were valued companions of any serious medical toolkit, seconded only to knives and unchecked enthusiasm. Bloodletting charts existed. They detailed which veins to open, for which ailments: a headache, right arm fever, left ankle, melancholy behind the knee. Just in case these charts were based on centuries of theory, artistic diagrams, and a deep faith in human fluids. Being the source of most problems, cupping was also used. Horns or cups were heated and pressed to the skin, creating suction that raised blood toward the surface. This was believed to balance humors, draw out impurities, and prevent illness. What it usually did was leave circular bruises and a lingering suspicion of the healer's qualifications. Barber surgeons handled much of the practical medicine. They shaved beards, pulled teeth, drained abscesses, and lanced boils all in one appointment. If requested, their tools clattered inside, leather rolls stained and slightly mismatched. They worked in markets, side rooms, and sometimes bath houses. A good one was respected, a bad one left behind. Limp patience and dented confidence. Hospitals, such as they were, prioritized shelter over surgery. These were often monastic institutions. Patients lay in rows on straw mattresses. Windows were few. Ventilation was a rumor. Linens were changed when they could no longer be ignored. Nurses were nuns or monks who believed service to the sick purified the soul. They washed patients with herbal water, applied ointments, and read prayers over the dying. Cleanliness in hospitals was aspirational. Pests were common. Rats ran freely. Fleas were practically starved, yet there was structure. Monks kept herb gardens, dried lavender to hang above beds, and burned sage to purify the air. Sickness was a physical state, but it was also seen as a spiritual test. Purity of the soul mattered more than sterility of the sheets in homes. Care was domestic. A mother might grind comfrey root for a broken bone. A grandmother might rub nettle oil into a twisted ankle. Healing was a family affair. Recipes were passed down, often whispered, rarely written. A good healer knew how to mix fever, few when to scald milk, and which prayers to say before pouring vinegar onto an open wound. Not all ailments were treated equally. Leprosy was feared and misunderstood. Lepers were exiled to the outskirts, housed in colonies where they lived with minimal care and maximum stigma. They wore bells to signal their approach. Their wounds were tended with basic salves, and their hygiene consisted of river water and resignation. Mental illness was even more poorly treated. The afflicted were considered possessed. Cursed or morally flawed treatments included confinement, isolation, cold baths, and exorcisms. Hygiene for these individuals was rarely prioritized. They were sometimes chained, sometimes beaten, occasionally pitied, and frequently ignored. Childbirth was dangerous. Midwives were central figures blending folk knowledge with practical experience. They washed their hands when possible with wine or vinegar. Cord cutting was done with knives, flint or teeth. The mother was bathed only if time allowed. Infants were rubbed with salt washed in herbal water and wrapped tightly. If both survived the birth, it was celebrated with gratitude and a strong drink. Medical texts were scarce handwritten in Latin and illustrated with optimism. Remedies included instructions for mixing herbs with lard, boiling frog skin, or applying ashes of burnt shoes. Not all recipes were dangerous. Some were surprisingly effective, but the lack of standardization meant results depended heavily on luck, weather, and interpretation of the scarce. Academic medicine was growing. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford offered lectures on Galenic theory. Students studied human anatomy, using animals guessed at internal functions, and debated the influence of planetary movements on fevers they believed in. Balance, hot and cold, wet and drabness, and blood hygiene played a part. But moderation was more important. A clean patient might still suffer if the moon was in the wrong phase. Traveling, healers filled gaps. They wandered from village to village, selling potions, offering treatments, and telling stories. Some were honest. Others were charlatans. They sold snake oil without snakes, miracle tonics with questionable herbs, and guaranteed cures that worked precisely. Never still, they were welcomed part doctor, part entertainer, part hope. Plague had not yet devastated Europe, but smaller outbreaks of illness prepared the ground towns, developed rudimentary quarantine practices. Homes with illness might be marked. Whole streets were avoided. Healers burned sulfur in sick rooms, washed walls with vinegar, and wore herbal amulets. The link between cleanliness and health was forming, one outbreak at a time. Some forward thinkers emphasized bathing. A few doctors argued that washing the body reduced odors, which might reduce disease. Others insisted baths opened the pores and invited danger. The result was confusion. People bathed, but nervously. They cleaned wounds, but only when they smelled offensive. They boiled water, but mostly for broth. Despite it all, there was care. There was effort. People tried it. They wiped blood with cloths that were rinsed in cold streams. They gathered herbs from wild hills. They saved bandages, rewound them, and said prayers as they tightened the knot. The human body was mysterious, and hygiene was not yet science, but it was attention. Tenderness, repetition to get sick was ordinary to be treated, was hopeful to survive, was remarkable in the 1200s. Religious cleanliness and symbolic washing. Cleanliness and religion were not always about soap. Often they were about symbolism. Washing did not necessarily mean removing dirt. It could mean removing sin. A clean face could express humility. Clean hands might prepare the soul. Feet, if scrubbed, were not being sanitized so much as sanctified monasteries embodied this contradiction. Monks bathed infrequently, usually only several times a year, in accordance with strict monastic schedules. Yet they washed parts of their bodies routinely, often several times per day. Hands and faces were cleansed before meals, after sleep, before prayer. And on holy days, not for comfort, not for hygiene, but for ritual. The act of washing was done in silence from a shared basin using cold water. The basin was rarely emptied between uses. The water's physical state mattered less than its symbolic meaning. These ritual washings reinforced structure. Clean hands meant readiness for sacred acts. Dirty hands, like a wandering mind, suggested spiritual laxity. The idea was not to cleanse away germs. Germs were not known, but to remove disorder from the soul. Foot washing was more formal. It occurred on specific days, most notably Maundy Thursday. On that day, monks washed each other's feet in a ceremony, emulating Christ washing the feet of his disciples. It was meant to remind them of humility, service, and obedience. A younger monk knelt to clean the older's feet. The water was cold, the cloth rough, the air often still with reverence. The feet might be cracked, fungal, or battered from years of walking stone floors, but they were treated with grace. Pilgrims to practice symbolic washing, they cleansed their faces and hands upon reaching shrines, springs, and sacred fountains. Some walked for months across Europe, their skin covered in dust, their feet blistered and worn, reaching a holy site and touching water, however murky or shared, was a profound act of spiritual transition. A splash on the brow or a rinse of the palms marked arrival, not hygiene in monasteries. Large communal wash basins called lavatoria lined the cloister walks. These were stone troughs, often fed by a constant stream of water. Via aqueduct or cistern, monks stood shoulder to shoulder washing in silence, the sound of dripping echoing across the flagstones. The water flowed not for sanitation, but as a metaphor of divine grace. Constant flowing shared clean garments were also part of religious hygiene. Priests wore white albs and embroidered chasubles, all of which had to be spotless during Mass. The garments were handled carefully, stored in wooden chests, lined with linen, and laundered with an almost ceremonial reverence. A priest who stepped to the altar with a visible stain might not be scolded, but he might be judged by both his peers and his congregation clean. Robes meant spiritual attentiveness. Wrinkled hems could suggest distracted devotion. Yet bathing the full body was discouraged. Church teachings warned that frequent immersion weakened the body, invited sin, or stirred inappropriate vanity. To bathe too often was to risk indulgence. It was seen as a luxury of the flesh, not a requirement of the spirit. Some saints were praised specifically for their refusal to wash. St. Thomas of Canterbury allegedly abstained from bathing so thoroughly that his robes became part of his skin. This was viewed not as slovenliness, but as divine detachment. Hermits and ascetics rejected washing entirely. Living in caves, huts, or makeshift shelters, they saw the body as a trap. Dirt was a reminder that the world was not eternal. Soap, warmth, comfort, these were temptations. By allowing themselves to become filthy, they testified to their faith. The worse they smelled, the more they proved their resistance to earthly pleasure. And yet, paradoxically, the church washed the dead before burial. The body was cleansed with holy water, wine, or even blessed oils. The process was gentle. The limbs were sponged. The face was wiped. The mouth might be closed, the hair combed. All of this was practical. The dead decayed quickly, but it was also sacred to clean. The dead was to prepare them for divine judgment. It was the final washing, the one that sent the soul forward. Sometimes the cloth used in washing the dead was preserved. If the person was believed to be saintly, the linen might be kept as a relic even in death. The act of cleansing could ripple forward into veneration. Holy water had immense symbolic weight. It was sprinkled on objects, homes, people, animals. It purified the altar, warded off evil, and prepared the mind. Pilgrims carried small flasks, filled at shrines, dangling from belts or stashed in pouches. Holy water was splashed on newborn soldiers, livestock, and even travelers leaving on long journeys. It smelled tinged with dust. Metal and rosemary was tied to the sacred public churches, engaged in larger acts of cleaning. Before major feast days, candlesticks were polished. Altars were wiped, floors were swept, banners were dusted and hung anew. Parishioners participated. The cleaning became a form of communal penance. To scrub the stone floor of a church with your hands was to humble yourself before God. A blister from scouring the pews was as good as a confession, and yet suspicion lingered around people who seemed too clean. A man who bathed too often might be considered vain. A woman who wore fragrant oils might be accused of seduction, or pride scent was heavily policed. It could indicate holiness if it came from incense, or moral looseness if it came from perfume. Social class made a difference. A noble who smelled of rose water was admired. A servant who tried the same might be punished. This double standard extended into the visual as well. A monk who washed his hands daily, but never his robe, was respected for his discipline. A woman who kept a tidy home but braided her hair too carefully might be accused of neglecting her soul. Metaphors of cleanliness filled sermons. Priests preached about washing away sin, rinsing the mouth of lies, scouring the soul with prayer. These were not idle phrases. They shaped behavior. People scrubbed harder before church. They dressed in freshly aired clothes. They sprinkled their animals before feast days and wiped their children's faces with the corners of their tunics. Baptism was the ultimate spiritual bath. Whether performed on infants or converts, it was a moment of transformation. Water touched the skin, but it was the soul that was being cleansed. Some churches built elaborate fonts, stone basins waist high and full of cold water. Others used simpler bowls. Either way, the act was the same: entrance through water into grace. Certain pilgrimage towns installed bathhouses near the entrances to holy sites. These were basic wooden structures where weary travelers could rinse off before approaching relics. Soap was optional, so was modesty. But the intention mattered. Washing became part of the devotional act. One did not kneel before a saint while covered in weeks of road dust and questionable puddles. Art reinforced these ideas. Paintings and stained glass showed angels washing the feet of saints, Mary wiping the face of the infant Christ, and Christ himself kneeling with a basin before Peter. Water glowed in these images. It reflected light and mercy. It was not about cleanliness. It was about care. Cleanliness might not save a soul, but it might prepare the way. It offered form in a world of formless hardship. It gave people something to do: hands to scrub cloth, to fold feet, to rinse while they waited for grace. In a time when so much was uncertain, the act of washing something, anything, became a tiny victory. Because in the medieval world, water could be many things: cold, symbolic, rare. But above all, it was a way to act out hope. The medieval market was a swirling hive of hygiene in the marketplace and workspaces, trade, gossip, livestock, mud, and depending on the season, a pungent medley of everything that ran rotted or was recently butchered. Hygiene in these spaces was not absent, it simply followed a different logic, one shaped by practicality, availability, and an admirable ability to ignore smells that would drop a modern nose on the spot. Markets operated daily or weekly, depending on the size of the town. They were held in public squares or open roads and spilled into every available corner. Merchants sold vegetables beside fishmongers, while blacksmiths hammered iron. Not far from women peddling rushes or dried herbs. Waste disposal was a community activity, in the sense that everyone participated in avoiding it. Hygiene measures were ad hoc and reactive. If the smell became unbearable, someone might toss straw on it. If the flies got too enthusiastic, someone might mutter a complaint or light a handful of dried rosemary and wave it around with half faith and full hope. Fishmongers, for instance, rinsed their stalls with buckets of water, often fetched from nearby rivers that also served as public sewers. The rinse removed scales, blood, and unwanted eyeballs only to run into the street, mingle with horse manure, and wait for the next set of shoes. If the merchant was conscientious, they might sweep the refuse into a nearby ditch. If they were not, it remained gradually liquefying into the street soup that defined many town centers in warm weather. The odor was robust in winter. It simply froze in place, waiting patiently for spring. Butchers operated under similar logic. Their work produced blood bones and bits that defied polite categorization. Most butchers used wooden blocks as cutting surfaces. These blocks were not cleaned so much as scraped, flipped over, and eventually burned. Blood soaked into the boards. The ground and the hands of the workers' gloves were not worn. Aprons were rarely changed. One could identify a butcher by scent alone. By midday, the flies had established a democracy. Bakers had their own space, often hotter, more aromatic, and slightly less revolting. The smell of bread helped mask the less appetizing notes of medieval air. Bakers dealt with flour dough yeast and coals. They washed their hands more frequently, at least in theory, because sticky dough clung like regret. Their ovens were cleaned by fire. Their tools were wiped on aprons, rats, and flour. Beetles were familiar, but rarely advertised food vendors, selling cooked meat pies or stews, worked in open air, often over charcoal braziers. The food was served hot, which helped kill some of the bacteria and most of the doubts. Utensils were minimal. Bowls were made of wood or cheap pottery. Washing dishes involved rinsing them in the same barrel until the water turned opaque. Then it was changed or just stirred. Ale houses were similarly pragmatic. Drinking vessels were wiped with cloths that had witnessed history. The ale itself was safer than water. Thanks to fermentation, patrons drank communally shared benches and coughed with abandoned spoons and knives. Where communal salt was handled by fingers that had likely explored many surfaces before arriving at the table. Still, people gathered, drank, and lived long enough to do it again the next day. Textile workers, such as fullers, weavers, and dirers, had distinct hygiene challenges. Fulling involved pounding wool in water mixed with urine collected from neighbors or donated for a small fee. The ammonia softened the fibers. The smell softened one's sense of optimism. Fulling mills were built outside of town for good reason. Workers stomped the cloth with bare feet, rinsed it in streams, and then laid it in fields to dry, where birds contributed opinions from above. Dyers worked with plant-based pigments, mordants, and heat. They boiled fabric in large vats, often over open fires. The water turned vibrant, then viscous, then questionable. Gloves were rare dye, stained skin nails, and everything it touched. The hands of a dyer could reveal what color was fashionable. That season, cleaning the vats was secondary to producing the next batch. Some dyers boasted a rainbow of scars. Blacksmiths, coopers, and carpenters did not focus on hygiene unless it interfered with their work. Soot, sawdust, and grease were constant. Workbenches were stained. Tools were wiped on aprons, not cleaned. Burns, cuts, and splinters were treated with spit rags, and the occasional dab of honey infection was part of the process. A smith with all 10 fingers was admired. One with 9 was experienced. One with 8 had either terrible luck or very fast reflexes. Barbers operated in shops that doubled as surgical stations. They cut hair, trimmed beards, pulled teeth, and lanced boils. Their tools were hung on walls or laid on tables. Washing involved a quick rinse and a prayer. The same blade that shaved a chin might be used to bleed an arm. The chair was wooden. The floor was straw-covered. The smell was antiseptic, only in the sense that it was strong enough to scare away microbes. And maybe a few customers, laundry workers, faced constant exposure to filth. Clothes were soaked, beaten, scrubbed, and boiled. The water was hauled by hand. Ash was added to soften it. Soap, if used, was homemade in coarse. Laundresses often worked beside rivers, leaning over stones while knuckles cracked and backs protested. Their hands were permanently wrinkled. Their clothes bore the scent of smoked lime and wet wool. If they were lucky, the water flowed downstream. If not, they worked in the runoff from someone else's optimism. Street cleaners existed, in some towns often. Criminals sentenced to public labor or the very poor earning coins, their job was to shovel animal droppings, scrape refuse from gutters, and clear market waste. They worked with brooms, rakes, and shovels and were expected to smell like their profession. No one thanked them, but everyone noticed when they were gone. A missing cleaner meant a day of careful foot placement, and a week of regret-privy maintenance was essential. But unpleasant gong farmers, those heroic night workers, emptied cesspits beneath houses and public latrines. They hauled the waste outside the town, often dumping it into designated pits or fields. The job paid well, mostly because no one else wanted it. Gong farmers were avoided, socially admired, economically, and utterly indispensable. If you saw one at a tavern, you did not comment. You gave them space and the occasional ale for services rendered women. Selling herbs, flowers, or perfume did what they could to introduce fragrance into the chaos. They sold bundles of rosemary, lavender, or mint. Some sprinkled their stalls with rose water. Others offered scented pouches to wear around the neck, claimed to ward off bad air, and even worse luck, their presence was a temporary reprieve for noses overwhelmed by the butcher and the fishmonger. For a few coins, you could smell like a hope instead of a compost pile. Despite the chaos, a strange order held the marketplace together. People developed resistance not just to disease, but to disgust. They knew where to walk, when to hold their breath, and which stalls changed their straw. Most often the smell of fresh bread, roasted meat, or ripening apples provided brief intermissions between gusts of humanity. Even a well-placed pie cart could improve morale. Sanitation laws existed in some cities. Regulations required merchants to clean their stalls, to dispose of waste, to cover meat. These laws were enforced irregularly and ignored strategically. Inspectors were bribed with food. Fines were paid in produce. The balance between hygiene and commerce tilted based on hunger. Not principle, one could be fined for failing to cover meat with cloth, or one could offer a hot roll and avoid paperwork entirely. Yet somehow people endured. They ate, traded, laughed, and haggled over turnips. They wiped their hands on their tunics and sampled pickled eels with joy. Children played in the alleys. Dogs snuck bones from butchers. Pigeons dropped commentary from rooftops. The medieval market thread, chaotic and alive, because hygiene in the medieval workspace was not about sterilization. It was about rhythm. Work, wash, work again. Rinse tools when time allowed. Clean what needed to be clean, leave the rest for the rain, and occasionally toss a bucket of water into the street and call it progress, personal grooming, and the social politics of dirt. In the 1200s, Grooming was more than hygiene. It was performance cell. Respect and survival rolled into a daily ritual of effortful maintenance and practiced denial, while modern grooming conjures images of scented lotions and mirror-lit bathrooms. Medieval grooming was often done with one eye on the weather, one hand holding a comb and one foot trying to avoid stepping in something best left undefined hair. For both men and women was a central feature of personal grooming. Not only was it a canvas for style and social identity, it was a known haven for lice gnats, and the occasional poetic metaphor combs were carried on belts or tucked into satchels. They were made of bone wood or horn, and were often double-sided with fine teeth for hunting lice and wider teeth for detangling. Combing was public and unapologetic. People did it during conversation, during meals, even during sermons, provided the priest was sufficiently distracted by his own dandruff. Lice were so common that not having them might have been considered suspicious. Remedies varied. Some applied vinegar, others used garlic paste, and a few brave souls rubbed ashes mixed with bear fat into the scalp, then combed vigorously until the lice either died or fled to more hygienic hosts. Certain herbs such as wormwood and rue were tucked into braids or sewn into head coverings to deter infestation. Whether they worked or simply smelled strong enough to convince the lice to relocate remains unclear. Children were the most infested and the least concerned, often treated in the street with a comb and a scowl. Beards were a different story. Styles varied by region and era. Monks and clergy were often clean-shaven as a sign of humility, while nobles grew carefully shaped beards to signal status and maturity. Peasants did what they could, often trimming with knives or singeing off scraggly ends with hot irons. There were no razors as such, just blades sharp enough to terrify the whiskers into submission. Beard oil existed, though rarely called that. It was usually animal fat scented with herbs or left unscented if the user preferred to smell like salted mutton. Beard combs were smaller versions of hair combs, and trimming was often a communal event. One man steadied the head, another did the cutting, and a third gave advice that was usually ignored. Eyebrows and eyelashes were left mostly alone. Occasionally, a noble woman might pluck her brows thin to match a fashionable silhouette. Tweezers made of bronze or iron were used for this purpose, often doubling as splinter removers and general pincers. Eyelashes were never painted, although soot or ground charcoal might be rubbed around the eyes in certain regions. Part beautification, part insect repellent, part confusion. Nails were trimmed with knives, or bitten long nails were not practical unless one was trying to signal that they did not do manual labor, for most nails were kept short through use alone, scrubbing, lifting, tilling, and the endless daily contact with soil. Ash and unmentionable's hands were scrubbed with sand or soap root, rubbed with salt or vinegar, and wiped on aprons with alarming enthusiasm. A hand free of visible dirt was either recently washed or recently idle. Teeth, as already mentioned, were brushed with cloths, rubbed with salt, and chewed clean. Using aromatic twigs, mouth rinses included wine vinegar and herbal infusions. Bad breath was masked with parsley, mint, or silence. Lip color was natural. Lip balm was animal fat, sometimes flavored with berry juice or resin, often applied with fingers that had just cleaned something else. Perfume, where used, was applied sparingly. Rose water was favored by those who could afford it. Lavender water was a close second. Scented oil was dabbed on wrists or behind ears. Commoners relied on herbal satchels, scented combs, or simply not smelling worse than their neighbors. In court, smelling pleasant could be a social weapon. In the fields, it was often seen as a suspicious extravagance, unless one was trying to impress a reeve or avoid a marriage negotiation. Ears were cleaned with linen twists or carved picks. Some were made of bone or ivory, others of wood. A clean ear was desirable, though rarely checked. More important was the absence of earache, which was treated with warm oil poured in gently, followed by plugging the canal with wool or old beliefs. Body hair was managed according to need. Some removed armpit or leg hair using tweezers or scraping blades, especially if lice were a problem. Others left it alone. There were no waxes, no sugaring, and definitely no laser removal. Hair removal was a function of necessity, not aesthetics. In some communities, body hair was a private matter. In others, it was a public topic of concern. If it brought fleas to dinner, scents carried, meaning someone who smelled of herbs might be seen as religious. Or recently healed, someone who reeked of fish might be freshly employed. Someone who smelled of nothing was either suspiciously fortunate or recently dunked in a stream. Smell could be a form of reputation lingering longer than words in some towns. There were even rumors that certain people's breath could spoil milk or sour a barrel of beer. Smell became myth. Clothing helped with grooming linen shifts. Absorbed sweat and oil, wool cloaks, deflected dirt, head coverings, coifs, veils, hats, kept hair clean and concealed lice outbreaks. Shoes contained straw for insulation and odor control gloves. Protected hands from grime injury and scandal accessories were often more functional than fashionable, though they often managed to be. Both decorative pins and combs could be status symbols as well as grooming aids. Social cues were built into grooming. A well-combed head might signal preparation for a meeting. Clean fingernails might precede a marriage negotiation. A perfumed kerchief might imply a message no one wanted to hear, spoken aloud. One's grooming was not private. It was public proof of effort, respect, and intent. Dirty hands might mean one had worked hard or had not washed after something regrettable. Clean shoes might imply a short walk or an important guest. Bathing may have been rare, but grooming was constant. People dusted their clothes with powdered herbs, beat the dirt from their tunics, and cleaned their shoes with rough cloth and spit polish. They adjusted their belts, picked lint from sleeves, and straightened collars before meals. A wooden mirror might be used, polished to reflect just enough to see that a face had not disappeared. The act of checking one's reflection, even faintly, reminded people that they still existed, still had control. Children were groomed by parents, roughly often, while squirming. Faces were wiped with damp cloths. Hair was combed with stiff brushes or sharp fingers. Hands were checked for grime. Ears were twisted. If disobedient, cleanliness was part of discipline. A clean child was a visible sign of responsible parenting, or at least a recent scolding children. Learned early to hold still, to present themselves decently, and to avoid rolling in mysterious puddles. Among the wealthy, grooming could be theatrical servants. Brushed hair, trimmed nails, and washed feet. Ladies sat for hours having braids woven, coifs adjusted, or perfumes layered. Men might have their beards styled, nails cleaned, and garments brushed while discussing politics or poultry. It was not just grooming, it was choreography. The body became a tableau of order and resources. Grooming was seen, discussed, and occasionally envied among the poor. Grooming was quick and functional, a splash of water, a comb through the hair, a wipe of the hands, and out the door. Tools were shared, advice was shared, fleas were shared. The goal was to look presentable, or at least not contagious. Grooming became a community effort. Neighbors helped braid each other's hair, delouse children, or lend a knife for trimming a wayward mustache, despite the limited access to baths and the many barriers to consistent cleanliness. Medieval people cared deeply about how they appeared. Grooming was not vanity, it was survival. In a world where disease lingered, where first impressions mattered, and where status could be seen in the sheen of a belt buckle, grooming was a daily necessity. It was not just about looking good, it was about saying, I am still trying, because in the medieval world, effort was everything. Clean fingernails might not stop a plague, but they might earn respect. A combed beard might not guarantee a job, but it might secure a conversation. A wiped nose, a brushed tunic, a half-washed face, these were not just signs of decency. They were declarations of hope. And sometimes that was enough. By the end of the 1200s, public health was not yet a profession, but it was increasingly a concern. Public health plague and the fear of filth. People had no microscopes, no germ theory, and no centralized system of sanitation. What they had were noses, instincts, and memories. They had seen what happened when disease took hold, and they knew without fully understanding why that dirt, waste, and foul air were dangerous. Hygiene became an act of fear, of repetition, of hope against the unknown. Before the Black Death arrived in the following century, smaller outbreaks of illness regularly swept through towns and villages. Dysentery fever, ergot poisoning, and other afflictions could decimate a family or cripple a community. When disease struck, people turned to the tools they had: smoke, prayer, herbs, and distancing. It was not quarantine in the modern sense, but the logic was similar. Avoid the sick, burn what could be burned, and wash what could be reached. Public baths were sometimes closed during outbreaks. Latrines were cleaned more thoroughly, at least temporarily. People burned aromatic herbs indoors and carried pomanders stuffed with clove, lavender, or rosemary. Doors were marked with symbols. Stories spread about cursed wells, vengeful saints, or poisoned bread. It was not a system, but it was a strategy, built from fragments of truth and mountains of fear. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence began to develop basic ordinances. These included where waste could be dumped, when markets had to be cleaned, and which trades were responsible for their own refuse. Regulations were often ignored, and enforcement was inconsistent. But the laws existed. A fishmonger could be fined for leaving guts in the street. A tanner might be ordered to move their vats of skin-stripping chemicals outside the city walls. It was the beginning of official hygiene, even if mostly symbolic. People started to notice patterns. Foul smells often preceded sickness. Rotten food caused more than stomachache. Crowded rooms bred coughs. None of this was yet science, but it was observation. Midwives, barbers, monks, and bath attendants passed on knowledge through stories, superstitions, and habits. A healer might not know what caused infection, but they knew which bandage smelled wrong. A washerwoman might not understand parasites, but she knew which shirt carried more than sweat. Waste was a growing problem. Towns became denser. Houses were built close together. Cesspits overflowed. Rats moved in. Rain turned filth into rivers. People walked with heads down, not out of humility, but to watch their steps. Shoes were scraped on stones outside. Homes Children were taught to play uphill from the street drains. It was not foolproof, it was barely effective, but it was better than nothing. Cleanliness became a moral signal. A tidy stall suggested an honest merchant. A brushed cloak implied respectability. A well-kept door front reflected the soul. Inside cities began to value appearance, not for beauty, but for what it might prevent. Pigs were banned from certain streets. Dogs had to be leashed. Butchers were ordered to clean up after themselves. The enforcement was inconsistent, but the shift was cultural. Cleanliness was becoming civic. Water quality was another concern. Wells were lined with stone, buckets were covered. Springs were blessed and protected. People who polluted at shared wells could be fined or publicly shamed. Beer and wine remained safer than water, not because they were cleaner when stored, but because the brewing process eliminated many of the invisible threats. Children drank weak ale, adults drank stronger versions, not for pleasure alone, but for preservation in churches. Cleanliness took on an additional urgency. Illness was seen as a judgment. A dirty church might be considered spiritually suspect. Floors were swept, pews wiped, fonts scrubbed. Holy water was refreshed regularly. The altar cloths were washed, aired, and checked for vermin. Hygiene became holiness. Purity of space was equated with purity of worship. A clean church was not just a symbol, it was a shield. Plague had not yet arrived in full force. But rumors of great dying had already circulated from distant lands. People were afraid a cough in the wrong setting could clear a room. Families buried their dead with haste. Clothes were burned, rooms were sealed. The line between caution and panic, blurred. Hygiene practices became more extreme. People washed with vinegar, wore layers of perfume cloth, and fasted in hopes of divine protection. Fear sharpened their habits. The invisible enemy was met with visible effort. Some towns appointed wardens to monitor health. They walked streets, inspected homes, ordered cleanings, and occasionally shut down bathhouses or bakeries. They were resented, bribed, or obeyed. Depending on the season, their tools were few. Their understanding was limited, but their presence meant that the idea of public health was stirring. These wardens did not wield stethoscopes or wear uniforms. They carried wooden staffs and heavy lists. They spoke with the authority of experience, and occasionally the scent of cloves to mask the stench of their rounds in rural areas. Cleanliness was more tied to nature. Villages washed in streams, dried laundry in sunlit fields, and swept dirt floors with stiff brooms. Manure was managed with pitchforks and caution. Herbs were hung in doorways, burnt in corners, and sprinkled in shoes. Animals were kept outside or inside depending on the weather and the size of the household. It was not pristine, but it was ordered. A home might smell of smoke and wet straw, but it did not mean neglect, it meant function. Folk remedies emerged to fight invisible illness. Some wore toad bones in pouches around the neck. Others carried written charms, bathed in dew on midsummer morning, or placed garlic on window ledges. Illness was seen as both physical and spiritual. Cleanliness therefore straddled both realms. A body could be purified by washing, a home could be purified by ritual, a town could be purified by procession. Healers advised spiritual cleansing alongside physical washing. A sick person might be bathed and confessed. In the same breath, a fast might be prescribed not for digestion, but for purification. Illness was treated with holy water and herbal tea, with poultices and penance. If all else failed, the priest and the barber worked together, the one for the soul, the other for the limb. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness hardened. Laziness was equated with uncleanness. A family who neglected to sweep their stoop might be assumed to neglect their faith. Clean clothes, even if patched, signaled diligence. Even small gestures mattered. Shaking straw out of shoes before entering a church. Wiping soot from one's face before a meal. Brushing crumbs from a tunic. Before confession, guilds began to regulate aspects of hygiene in their own ways. Tanners were pushed to the outskirts. Butchers had assigned dumping grounds. Barbers were expected to maintain clean tools, though the definition of clean remained loose. Merchants selling food had to cover their wares. Bakers cleaned ash chill from ovens. Brewers scoured barrels. These were not yet health codes, but they were the precursors. They were signs of a society beginning to acknowledge that order mattered despite the inconsistency and the superstition. People tried, they developed habits. They lit herbs in sick rooms. They avoided meat during fast days and aired their bedding in winter sun. They scraped waste from doorsteps and filled barrels with rainwater. They sewed herbal sachets into cloaks. They rinsed their hands in basins before meals. Not always, not everyone, but enough to matter. Cleanliness did not cure it, did not prevent outbreaks or stop plagues. But it provided structure. It offered comfort. It allowed people to believe they had some control. A mother brushing her child's hair before market. A merchant wiping his stall with damp cloth. A baker sweeping ash from the oven floor. These were not grand acts, but they were repeated every day, and in that repetition, a new kind of order was born, because in the 1200s, health was Fragile dirt was everywhere, but so was discipline. People could not see the enemy, but they could sweep, scrub, sprinkle, and soak. They could try, and sometimes trying was the only medicine available. The fire has long since burned low. The markets emptied, and the footsteps, good night, that once echoed through muddy streets, have faded into silence. The 1200s are behind you now. Faint outlines on parchment, quiet gestures, in candlelight, the slow rhythm of a world held together by repetition and resolve. Imagine the last moments of a day. In that time, a woman leans over a wash basin in the corner of her home, the water cloudy, her fingers stiff. She hums softly to herself, brushing dust from her child's cheeks, smoothing his hair with a hand that has wrung out linen and carried bundles of rushes from the market. There is no soap left, but the act matters. Across the town, a baker wipes flour from a bench with the corner of his apron, not because anyone will see it, but because tomorrow will begin again, and the bench should be ready. The smells are quieter now. The smoke has settled. The herbs in the rafters have dried to crisp paper. The vinegar water that once scrubbed a wound or polished a pew has long since been poured away. There is still dirt beneath fingernails, still lice in the braids, still the faint aroma of sheep in woolen cloaks. But the worst has been managed. The basin has been emptied. The straw has been shaken. The candle has been trimmed. They tried that as what lingers in the stillness. Effort, not perfection. Habit, not glamour. In the face of illness, in the absence of certainty, they combed, scrubbed, swept, and stirred. They did not always know why. They only knew they must. And now, as your own room grows quiet and your thoughts dim, let those rhythms carry you gently. Let them settle behind your eyes, soft and slow. The comb moving through hair, the cloth brushing a cheek, the hush of water being poured. Sleep well.